Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to PhD candidate Kate Porterfield and Dr. Eric Roy. Diverting organic materials and food waste from landfills and recycling them for beneficial use in agriculture is a great way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, intermingled microplastics from packaging and other sources could make these recycled materials less beneficial than they otherwise might be. This episode, Kate and Eric discuss their review paper studying the prevalence of these contaminants, how they're measured, and how these results intertwine with current policy efforts. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Kate Porterfield and Eric Roy with us. Kate is a doctoral candidate in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Vermont, where she studies the use of anaerobic digestion to recover resources from organic waste streams. She also earned her master's degree in natural resources from the University of Vermont and an undergraduate degree in conservation biology from Middlebury College. Eric is an associate professor in the Rubenstein School of Environmental and Natural Resources and a faculty fellow in the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. He leads the Nutrient Cycling and Ecological Design Lab at the University of Vermont, focusing on the intersection of ecosystem science and engineering in the context of resource management, water quality, and food systems. Prior to joining the University of Vermont, Eric was a postdoc in the Institute at Brown University for Environment and Society. He holds a PhD in Oceanography and Coastal Sciences from Louisiana State University, a Master's of Science degree in Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering from The Ohio State University, and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Old Dominion University. Hi, Kate and Eric. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to have you both here. So today we are talking about a very exciting topic, which is microplastics and kind of the role that they can play in organics recycling and food waste and all of that good stuff. So to get us started, can you just give us an overview of kind of microplastics in general and specifically the laws in Vermont that were impacting your research?
Sure. Kate, why don't you go ahead and give the general overview, and then I can talk about the Vermont law.
Cool. Sounds good. So microplastics in general are plastic particles smaller than 5 millimeters in some dimension. They've been studied for a much longer in aquatic ecosystems and were kind of first described in the oceans. And only more recently have scientists started to look for them in other places. So the focus of our research has been to look at microplastic presence in organic amendments, so compost, digestate, food wastes, and also agricultural soils.
I would just add that microplastics is one word, but it's actually a vast array of different polymer types, shapes. Some of these particles can also have chemical additives associated with them. So when we say the word microplastic, you can kind of just imagine a whole spectrum of possibility in terms of what type of particle we're actually talking about. And that is one of the challenging things about studying this topic. And so I can pick up a bit on the Vermont context in terms of laws. I think the most relevant law to this work we've been doing is the Universal Recycling Law. So the aim of the Universal Recycling Law in Vermont was to divert organic materials away from the landfill and to beneficial reuse. So that could include anaerobic digestion to produce energy, and then digestate containing nutrients. That could include composting to create compost, soil amendments. And that law really had a major effect on how organic materials move in the state of Vermont. As Vermont has enacted that law and folks in the industry have started to work to fulfill its what the law requires, one challenge that has come up is contamination. So often food waste, which in Vermont, the universal recycling law actually doesn't only target food waste from large generators, but also all the way down to the household level. So we have a lot of different types of food waste that are being managed under the universal recycling law. And often some of those can be contaminated to some degree with plastic. And in some cases, they are still completely packaged. So you can imagine, um, a batch of packaged food that is not possible to sell for one reason or another. Perhaps it's off spec. So a food manufacturer has, a good deal of packaged food. In Vermont, it's required that that organic material is recycled in some way. So the question becomes how to achieve that without introducing contamination. So that's one way contamination could potentially happen. And we can talk more about the details of how you might go about processing that type of material later. Another way is post-consumer food waste. So, if you're in a cafeteria in Vermont, you'll see your trash, recycling, and now a compost or green waste bin. And people are working to fulfill their roles in this system, but people are fallible. And we often see contamination in that separated organic stream. So that could be a bit of plastic packaging that makes it into that bin. It could also be something that somebody for some reason thought was compostable, but actually isn't compostable and is a plastic polymer. So those issues have caused concern in the state and have created attention focused on microplastics pollution.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great overview. That's really helpful. I want to try to get my brain wrapped around this process a little bit more. So, how, like, from the composting bin in that cafeteria or a big dumpster of it at a food processing plant. I don't know, I don't know how that works, obviously. Like, how does that go from wherever they're getting that organic material to somebody's field? How is that processed? I know you mentioned anaerobic, which is without oxygen, but also terms like digestate versus like compost. I'd like to know what are the differences between those two terms and just, yeah, kind of top to bottom process. How does that get from waste to field?
I can take the first part of that, Eric. So, composting and anaerobic digestion are two different strategies to turn organic waste um, into something that we can use and to recover value from them instead of just sending the organic waste to the landfill. So I think people tend to be more familiar with composting. People see it more often. You can do it at home. Um, but basically, composting is just breaking down organic material in the presence of oxygen. And so you're breaking it down into compost, which can then be applied to soils and contains nutrients and can support plant growth. Anaerobic digestion is when you break down organic material in the absence of oxygen. So that's why it's called anaerobic digestion. And you basically just put it into a large container, and microbes will break down the organic material and they convert some of it into biogas, which can be used as an energy source. And then what's left over is called digestate. And so it's usually, it's organic, rich, nutrient rich material. Like compost, it can be used, it can be spread on soils and the nutrients can support plant growth. So, which strategy is used? It totally depends on, the town, the specific system, the waste stream. Different waste streams are more suitable for one or the other organics recovery strategy. So the specific path is going to be really dependent upon, you know, what the waste type is, where you are in the state. Um, but in general, if we're talking about uh, kind of industrial management of the food waste, people can obviously do some composting of some types of waste in their backyard. You would have a hauler pick up the food waste and they would bring it to a centralized facility that was either doing composting or anaerobic digestion. And then, Eric, maybe do you want to talk about specifically packaged food waste and the extra processing steps that need to be taken with those?
Yeah, so Kate did a great job describing the different processes. I think the only thing I'll add is, with composting, not only is it under an aerobic environment, but there's specific protocols for reaching certain temperatures to try to kill pathogens and try to compost under a certain amount of time so that we can, in the most timely way possible, create a finished compost that would be, valuable as a soil amendment. And anaerobic digestion, similarly, there's things that we want in feedstocks to try to maximize the biogas production. And so folks running those operations might be more interested in a certain feedstock because it has a lot of energy potential. They might also be more likely to use a feedstock because it's a liquid feedstock, which wouldn't be as appropriate for composting, but does work nicely with anaerobic digestion. So when we get to the case of packaged food, this has been a real challenge. And, it turns out in Vermont, there's been some work done, and this is not a minor fraction of the overall organic waste stream. Packaged food, whether it's from grocery stores that have food that goes out of date or food manufacturers, takes up a sizable chunk of the overall organics fraction. So we need to have a strategy for how to deal with that material in the best way possible, aside from sending it to the landfill. And so there's basically two ways to unpackage something. One is human labor. So you can, meticulously try to unpackage everything. But as you can imagine, we face some limitations in scaling that when we're talking about a large amount of material. So that has created some work done in engineering to develop mechanical depackaging machines. So these are machines that the goal of them is to remove the organic waste material from its packaging while creating as pure of an organic waste stream as possible. And so these are, large, expensive pieces of equipment. There's one in Vermont. There's some in other parts of the world. Manufacturers have tended to report, separation efficiency around 99%. We have studied the output from one of these machines and found that the contamination rate was relatively very low, much under 1%. So they work well, but they're not perfect. I think it's surprising how well they do work, and really a feat of engineering. But there is some, very, very small fraction of the plastic that during the mechanical depackaging process, which is intended to not rip up the plastic into a bunch of pieces, but to use pressure and paddles to remove the packaging in as large of chunks as possible and then have it go to a different stream. So, these aren't grinders. They're not grinding everything up together. They're trying to remove it. But during that process, you still get some fracturing of the plastic. Say there's a bottle cap in there and the paddle hits it the wrong way and it shatters. And maybe a little piece of that is not able to be separated from the food waste stream. That type of material can still get through. And even though it's a very small amount by mass of the final organic stream, it's still there. And so that creates some concern about what might happen to that material in the environment. I should also say that if we turn to human labor, the research so far shows that humans aren't perfect either. So if we do have humans separating this in a very laborious fashion, there's a good chance that that organic stream is not going to be 100% pure either. So regardless of which direction we go, the more kind of scalable mechanical direction or the more labor intensive direction, we still have this challenge of, these slight imperfections in purity that over time add up to a decent flow of microplastics into the environment.
Sure, sure. This is great. I didn't realize we were going to like take a little rabbit trail into engineering, and that made me really happy. So you were then doing research that was related to these contamination levels and the impacts that can have on agriculture when these composts and digestates are used in fields. So, can you tell me a little bit more about your research goals and what you found?
Yeah, so when we were first starting out looking at this issue, the obvious first step was to try and figure out what other people had done and figured out already. So we set about conducting a literature review and kind of scoured the internet to try and find, who has actually measured microplastics and plastic content in composts and digestates and food wastes. And that was a really helpful process because, it started to give us a sense of like, oh, wow, wherever people, there's not a ton of studies out there that have done this so far. And most of them have been conducted like in Asia and Europe, a lot fewer in the United States. So that was the first thing we noticed. And then the second thing was that it seemed to be that wherever people were looking for plastic in these organic materials, they were tending to find it in really varying amounts. So we found huge ranges of plastic content reported in these different types of materials. Another thing, or yeah, I won't get too much into the results yet. If you want me to just talk about research goals. Eric, do you want to talk about our kind of second tact of study?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk about the review paper for a little uh,
Yeah.
bit first, and then maybe circle back to some of the follow up work at
Okay.
the end. But yeah, I mean, as Kate described, it's kind of standard research process. We're not interested in recreating the wheel, and we need to put our research interests into a broader context. And we felt like we were doing a service by collecting all of this information on what's known out there and then synthesizing it into a single review paper that not only lists what people have found, but discusses the methodologies they use to find those results, how methods matter, what methods may be more appropriate in the future. And, we were very focused not only on kind of the technical aspects of microplastics analysis, but also how that works within a policy context. Because at the time, there was actually, more discussion happening in Vermont, and eventually, this kind of happened as the paper was being published, or in the publication process. Somewhere along the line, there was debate within the state legislature about a proposed bill that would actually set a regulatory limit on how much microplastic contamination could exist within a compost or digestate or other soil amendment. So, we were trying to offer that service as scientists of bringing the science into a format that is not only useful for those of us measuring these things, but also useful to the people considering possibly regulating or monitoring them.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Kate and Eric's paper, Microplastics in Composts, Digestates, and Food Waste, a review, published in the Journal of Environmental Quality, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsor, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Sure. Yeah, and I think in your paper you talked about specifically how some of that variance between experiments can have an impact on not only for research that's comparing research to research, but also putting that in a format that interfaces well with policy requirements. You know, are they talking about the same thing? So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this was really interesting to get into. But so basically, so Eric talked earlier about how microplastics is one word, but it is a word that's referring to so many different things. So first of all, there are tons of different types of plastic out there, but then for every type of plastic, you know, there are thousands of potential additives and coatings that might be included in it to give it different properties, chemical barrier properties. And then, some film plastics, they'll actually just like laminate a whole bunch of different materials to each other. So it's a huge category of things out there, and it makes it really challenging to measure that. And so a lot of people around the world have tried a lot of different measurement methods, and I don't think I've seen anything yet that is perfect. You kind of have to make, there's a lot of trade-offs and decisions you have to make. One of the big ones is how small are you going to go, or can you feasibly go? So, we know, generally agreed upon that microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters. But what do you say that your lower detection limit is? And what we started to notice in these studies is everyone was using a different lower detection limit. So, brings me to a second kind of critical piece of the measurement thing is a lot of the methods that we do have access to right now for quantifying microplastics, they give us measures of abundance. So how many particles are there in this material per liter or per kilogram? And that's why, you see in headlines, sometimes you'll see like scientists found, X thousand particles in this thing. The problem with quantifying things by particle is a particle could be any number of things. A particle could be as big as a bottle cap, or it could be as small as a poppy seed. And so when you're saying some number of particles, it's really hard to understand, how much material are we really talking about? And if one study is looking at all particles greater than a millimeter, and a different study is looking at all particles bigger than half a millimeter, then you're going to get different numbers, and it's really hard to compare them to each other. So that was something that was immediately apparent to us is, everyone's using kind of different, looking at different ranges of particle size and getting these different numbers. And we don't really, we can't really compare them to each other super well. So that was one kind of important finding. Now, some studies, and I think increasingly more studies, are focusing on measuring the amount of plastic as a weight composition. So there is, X% of this material is made up of plastic. And we tend to like that measure more because there's a little bit less ambiguity, and it's a bit easier to compare between studies using that kind of measure. Now, you still have to decide what's your lower detection limit with that. So, that is definitely still a challenge, and one that I think we're hopeful in the future. There's all scientists out there who are working on different types of measurement methods that don't rely on kind of counting the particles first, ones that can allow us to get a direct mass measurement. And that, I think, is that makes me really hopeful that eventually we'll have some sort of standard method that will allow us to easily quantify the amount of plastic in a material in a way that is comparable across different measurements. But I don't know if we're quite there yet.
I would just add to what Kate said to make that link to policy. When we look at the policies that are on the books or the policy that was being considered in Vermont that actually got tabled for the time being and why they do more study, those are on a weight basis. So they're saying, this material can have no more than, for example, 0.5% plastic contamination is one threshold that was being considered. So that's great. But then if you look at the research and you're trying to get a handle on what does that mean, and many of the papers are only reporting counts, there's just this kind of mismatch between the science and the policy. And so it's our job as scientists to try to kind of avoid that and try to figure out ways to provide the information that would actually be needed, and not only needed to determine where the threshold would be, but any sort of regulation, if it's going to be enforced, will need some sort of monitoring program. So, how exactly are these materials going to be analyzed and assessed to determine whether they pass the limit or not? That was something that seems to be just a very important practical challenge when it comes to trying to reduce the flow of microplastics in the environment.
Yeah, for sure. I have a couple of questions off of that, one of which may be a little too far afield from this, so feel free to pass on this one. So, my first one, I'm gonna ask both at the same time, so I don't forget them. My first one is, obviously researchers are very meticulous about why they measure the things they do and how they measure them. So I'm curious as to why researchers would find it beneficial within their context to go by count rather than weight. And if you think that's something where they're just looking at something very different than what policy is looking at, and what that situation looks like potentially. And then my second question is about the weight, because I'm just a little bit curious about how that can be impacted by the non-plastic materials in that situation. So if you're doing weight in like a more clay type material versus loamy versus sand, throwing out all of the soil terms that I know. Obviously that's very different because plastic is typically a very light material, or if you have plastic bags that are shredded into it versus chunks of bottle cap, that might be more dense. So how do you reconcile those things? And then if you feel that it's fair to maybe speculate as to the differences in what researchers are collecting, I would love to know.
Those are both really good questions. The thing with the count is it is really challenging to measure microplastics. And a lot of that challenge comes from needing to isolate them from whatever your matrix is to start. And that is, I think, a kind of a key holdup right now that a lot of people are working on, and I think making some progress. But right now, there's no easy way to just take any material and extract all of the microplastics and all the plastics from it, so that you can just focus on them. It's like it's like looking for a needle in a haystack a lot of the time. And with different types of matrices, it's easier or harder. With water, a lot of the time you can filter the water and collect all the particles. When we're talking about something like compost or food waste, that's not super practical. They're incredibly, organic, heterogeneous materials, and just getting the microplastics out of them in the first place is one of the biggest challenges. And so when you are able to get them out, often they're still covered in, contaminated with organic material. And like you said, they're so light. So we do, in our own research, we directly weigh, like using a microbalance, any particles that we're able to weigh. But some of them are so small that they're really difficult to even manually manipulate to put on a scale. And they might be covered with organic material that is difficult to get off. In the case of film plastics, they also might be laminated against paperboard, and difficult to extract from that paperboard. So the biggest, that makes it easier to just count them, um, although there are still some issues with that. Weighing is not always a feasible possibility with the things that we're working with. And then your second question about, different types of plastics having different, features like that is a really good one, and you're totally right about the differences in density, between film and, maybe chunks of bottle cap and stuff. And I think that feature is what has led some, municipalities, or, governing bodies that have established weight-based limits on plastic and organic materials to establish even more specific limits, for film plastics, because they're so light. um, you don't want to have a material where you can see a whole bunch of plastic, even if it's small by a mass standard. So that is definitely something that people are thinking about, and I think that underscores the challenge of establishing regulatory limits on microplastics. Is it's such a diverse class of materials.
Yeah, I'll just speak to your question, Abby, about different types of soil and how if you look at it on a per dry kilogram basis of soil, you might actually be talking about quite a different volume of soil. And that's a great point. We've been mostly focused on microplastics in organic residuals, including compost, digestate, and food waste. And within that context, our preference and the preference of most scientists is to focus on dry matter as the denominator. And that is because water content can be so variable, and we don't necessarily want to incentivize, dilution by water addition to a waste stream to create a more favorable result. Now, when you think about the soil context, it's a little different, and I think within that context, it might be good to also couple the reporting of the microplastic content per dry kilogram soil with some sort of volume based estimate, or also an area based estimate, per square meter of soil might be appropriate. And people are starting to do this, and as people think about regulations, one more thing that comes to mind right now as we're at this part of the conversation is a lot of the focus has been on the amount of microplastics within a soil amendment, as the point of regulation. But we've also encouraged folks to think also about cumulative loading to soils over time. So theoretically, you could, add a lot of a contaminated compost that might pass the threshold and just be under the limit for percent weight of microplastics, but you're adding a lot of it across the environment or to a specific soil. And so in order to kind of look at the issue from two angles, I think it's important to also think about, for this particular field, what has been the cumulative loading over a given year or over a longer time horizon, so that we can do what's most important, in my opinion, and that's avoid getting into highly contaminated situations with certain areas.
Yeah, for sure. It's not gonna necessarily rinse away in the same way that certain nutrients might over time. So that's a great point. Um, I would love to move on to future research, because we've already started to inch into that a little bit. But if there's any other like results from the initial review that you wanted to share, please do. But then yeah, where are we going? Obviously there are tons of directions to move in with this, so I'm excited to know what you think those are.
Sure. Yeah, I think a couple of more points from the review paper that I think are worth mentioning um, is just to reinforce the point that this seems to be a systemic issue. We're seeing it across different processing strategies. So, composting is not inherently cleaner from a microplastics perspective than anaerobic digestion and vice versa. Like this problem is something that is a challenge to any strategy to manage food waste in a beneficial reuse situation. The other thing I'd say from the review papers, we also have found a lot of evidence that microplastics are already being observed in agricultural soils. So there's more work that needs to be done to understand um, the different pathways that microplastics can take to reach those agricultural soils. We know that soil amendments are one of those pathways, but that is one pathway among many potential pathways: atmospheric deposition, litter, tire wear, agricultural plastic use like plastic mulching and other plastic use on the farm. I mean, plastic's a very useful material, so it appears in all sorts of use cases. So that's another important step, is not only figuring out where the microplastics are in the systems creating soil amendments and how to mitigate that, but also trying to better understand the overall flow of microplastics to agricultural soils. What fraction of that do soil amendments account for? And then how do we mitigate those other flows that aren't related to soil amendments? So I just want to make those key points. In terms of future work, I'll kind of introduce it broadly and then turn it over to Kate to talk about some of the specifics. But actually during the process of writing the review paper, we were also doing our own primary research, looking at microplastic content in food waste, digestate, and compost. So we were in the lab, kind of working through the challenges we were describing other researchers working through in the review paper, of determining the best way to isolate microplastics, measure them, and to get a better sense of what the contamination levels were in these different materials. And one of our studies looked at several composting systems around the state of Vermont. So some that are including food waste as an important feedstock in their composting operation, and some that are more based on animal manure as a primary ingredient, without supplemental food waste. And we saw a range in microplastic levels across those sites that were sort of in line with reported values in the literature. But obviously, it does seem like several composts in the state do have microplastic contamination, and we're kind of better able to put those numbers into context. And then Kate's work, which she can describe better than me, focused on digestate and food waste and the role of a mechanical depackager in that system. So, Kate, do you want to describe that study?
Yeah. So for that study, where our main goal was just to try to characterize the amount of plastic contamination in depackaged food waste. Um, So we looked at two food waste streams. We looked at a pre-consumer waste stream, so it was fully packaged when it went into the depackager, and then a post-consumer food waste stream. So source separated organics that theoretically did not have any plastic in them initially. That's usually not the case. Um, Also passed through the depackager to remove some of that remaining contamination. And then we were also looking at plastic content of digestate, so what's left over after anaerobic digestion of that depackaged food waste stream. Um, and yeah, we found, you know, levels of plastic contamination in all of those materials that were fairly consistent with what we'd seen in the literature elsewhere, and kind of reinforced for us again what we'd the conclusion we'd come to after doing the review paper, which is that plastic contamination, low levels of plastic contamination are a systemic problem in organics recycling.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that sounds like great research to dig more into. That's wonderful. I'm excited to see where that goes. So, we have obviously had a very broad reaching conversation, touched on a lot of issues today. So, I think it would be helpful to kind of maybe put a finger on just like what are some of the key takeaways, recommendations, both for how to measure this, how we can improve the process, how to interface that with policy, things like that. So can we just get like some highlights?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do that first, and then Kate, you can fill in the gaps. Um, So I think for me, the key takeaway is we are making a lot of progress as a society in trying to move towards a more circular economy with food waste and other organic materials to try to divert them away from landfills where they are responsible for methane emissions, which have a climate impact, toward better reuse cases, so anaerobic digestion or compost. So we're starting to see places like Vermont actually establish regulations to really fundamentally change the flow of that material across the landscape. So that's a good thing. And it's important to remember that all of this starts with a very noble goal to reduce climate change impacts, to capture value in these organic materials, whether it's energy or nutrients, to beneficially reuse those materials in agricultural systems to support production. So that's the starting place, and that's all good. But what we're finding is that comes with practical challenges, and plastic contamination seems to be one of the most important. It's not the only challenge, certainly, but it is an important emerging challenge that threatens to undercut some of the benefits of moving towards a more circular food system. So what we found is that low level of plastic contamination, and an occasionally high level, but mostly low level plastic contamination in materials, is fairly widespread. So this is not just bad actors out there. This is a systemic issue where everybody is struggling to some degree to try to keep materials free of plastic, and especially small microplastics and below. We haven't used the word nanoplastics, but that comes up in the discussion sometimes too. These are really, really small. And so as that's happening, there's going to increasingly be pressure on policymakers and others to try to protect the environment. So now we've taken an environmental goal of organics recycling, and now we have kind of an environmental pushback of, wait a minute, this might lead to some contamination of our agricultural soils. So this is a really complicated challenge that requires policy that is informed by science and science that is suitable to create those policies. So in the review paper, we found that people around the world are working on this issue in Europe, the United States, China, elsewhere. This is not unique to the United States in any way. This is a challenge that's more global in scope. And I think as people increasingly get better at measuring these materials, measuring microplastics in these materials, and we have more data, that data can continue to inform better policies. And hopefully we can move towards a cleaner overall system. My view after working on this for a while is the solutions ultimately lie upstream. Packaging was not designed to be depackaged. It was designed for very specific food preservation purposes. And the materials used are not necessarily good from the perspective of a circular economy. So my hope, if I put on my more utopian hat, is that we see some radical changes in the packaging industry over time that will make it easier for those in the organics recycling industry to capture value from organic waste without struggling so much with microplastic contamination as a challenge to their efforts. Kate, anything else you'd like to add?
I think you nailed it.
Awesome. Yeah, love the utopian hat. That's one of my favorite hats. So I have three questions left for you then. So the first question is, if listeners want to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go?
Right. So I think the first place you could start would be the review article we published in the Journal of Environmental Quality. We're proud that that's open source, so anybody should be able to access that article who has an internet connection. Um, and other than that, we also published an article based on the follow-up work we discussed in uh, ACS Sustainable Chemistry and Engineering. So that article came out recently, and hopefully we'll have an article out shortly on the compost microplastic content. Other than that, I don't know, Kate, are there any other resources? Maybe the EPA
Yeah, I
report?
was going to say the EPA has an awesome emerging issues in food waste management series, and we've referenced them in some of our papers, and I think that's definitely a great resource.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll have links to all those in the show notes that we have links for. So, yeah, that's great. So, then if people want to take the next step and get involved with issues like this, and that could be researcher or civilian, not that researchers aren't also civilians, uh, what can they do to get involved?
I guess I'll go, Kate. Looks like you're thinking.
Well, I have some thoughts. I mean, anything we can do to encourage the packaging industry to innovate and move towards packaging for food materials is that is compatible with end of life management if needed. I think I agree with Eric in a utopian scenario. That's the direction we need to be moving towards.
I would just add to that that some of the compostable plastic or bioplastics on the market, these materials are getting better. There's several options out there. Some seem more appealing to me than others in terms of their properties. But right now, they're not yet a panacea. They're not going to kind of solve this problem. In fact, we've already started having some issues where certain compostable plastics are covered in PFAS. Certain compostable plastics look too much like regular plastics, so then people get confused about which is which, and they end up putting regular plastics into a green waste bin. So that we've started moving in that direction, but there's more work to be done, I think. And I'm inspired by folks, and I've heard of one story already where they are starting to make decisions to change materials in their packaging that will help with this issue. So yeah, that's what I hope for. So if people push forward on the policy efforts, whenever those come, a lot of emphasis gets put on the organics recycling industry, but just remember, they have to deal with all of society's waste and the packaging that comes with it. So really the ultimate solution is what's upstream. And so if states are going to try to make a push to help clean up streams, it should really include, at least, if not focus mostly on the packaging industry, because that helps everything downstream as well.
Awesome. Okay, very small bonus question. Can you define the acronym of PFAS just for people who don't know what that is, like me?
Yeah, it stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So um, they're a class of man-made chemicals characterized by a really strong carbon-fluorine bond, and they're used in a bunch of different, food packaging applications, unfortunately, and other types of consumer products. And some of them we're starting to find out can be really bad for you. And there's been a lot of movement. From states and maybe the federal government to try and start to address the issue of PFAS use. in our society. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. I mean, that's not awesome, but thank you. It's awesome that
Yeah.
you find it. Yeah,
Awesome.
I just heard the term like in a meeting the other day. I know it's like a big thing, so I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah,
our
it's definitely popping up more and more.
Yeah,
non
it's a very big
science
thing.
people know.
Yeah.
Um, cool. So thank you for defining that. So then our last question for reals this time is, what is one fun fact that listeners wouldn't know about you if all they had was your research?
Eric, do you want to go first?
Um, yeah, I guess I'll just say I'm a dad. So when I'm not doing research or interviews like this, I'm usually parenting in some capacity. I have two little kids. I say my daughter Iris has Down syndrome. So one of my passions is actually our local Champlain Valley Down syndrome group, where I interact with other folks with Down syndrome as well as their families. So that's kind of one of my extracurricular activities that I put a lot of energy into, is not only parenting, but working with that group as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah, my extracurricular activities, some might not come as too much of a shock, but I really like to work in my garden. Um, and I also enjoy mountain biking and reading historical fiction, and I listen to a ton of podcasts too.
Oh, nice. We're a fan of
Yeah.
podcasts here. Well, wonderful. Do you have any recommendations for podcasts?
Oh, I just I listen to Up First every morning. That's kind of my go-to.
Okay.
Um,
And Kate just introduced me to Hidden Brain, which
I love
I've
Hidden
only
Brain.
listened to one episode, but it was fantastic. So,
Ooh,
Yeah,
yeah.
super good.
nice. All right. Well, we've got some suggestions then. Um, so this has been an awesome conversation. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk with you today and highlight your paper and the work that you're doing. It's super important. So thanks for your research and for your time today.
Thanks
Thanks
so
so much,
much,
Abby.
Abby.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Jay. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi Abby, thanks for having me. And hello everyone, my name is Jaya Nepal. You can simply call me Jay. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Department of Soil, Water and Ecosystem Sciences, University of Florida. I do my research work at Indian River Research and Education Center in Fort Pierce, South Florida.
Wonderful. And what are you currently researching?
Well, for my PhD project, I'm currently evaluating the agronomic performance of noble water dispersible carbon nanoparticles as a soil amendment for sandy soils here in Florida. To give you a bit of a background, we have really high sandy soils here at Florida, and it contains very low organic matter. So as a result, the soil has a really low nutrient holding capacity. By adding carbon in the form of nanoparticles as soil amendment, what we're trying to achieve is to increase the nutrient retention capacity of sandy soils, and also trying to take advantage of some of the nanoscale properties of a particle, which helps to increase the reaction surface and also enhance some crop physiological processes.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that be?
Oh, wow, that's a nice question. I think the ultimate dream for me would be to lead an important research program in the area of soil fertility, quality, and crop nutrient management, ideally back in my home country, Nepal. Off the top of my head, one such project I would like to lead will be the soil health project that involves field research in identifying suitable nutrient management practices and indicators to promote and measure soil health and also sustain the agricultural productivity. As a researcher, I love to work closely in an interdisciplinary team along with extension agents, but especially close to the farmers so that our research stays relevant and not just something we do on paper.
Sure. Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Jay about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.